Now then, let's talk about something called the Cold War. It sounds a bit frosty, doesn't it? Well, in a way it was. Imagine two neighbours who really truly do not get along. They don't throw punches or shout over the fence every single day, but there's a definite chill in the air. They're always watching each other, trying to prove they are the better neighbour. They build taller fences and buy bigger, stronger dogs, not to fight, but to show the other who is in charge. This is a simple way to think about the Cold War. It was a long, tense standoff, a bit like a baking competition where the bakers never actually compete side by side, but instead try to outdo each other from their own separate kitchens for a very, very long time. This chilly period lasted for many years, from just after a very big conflict called World War II, which ended in 1945, all the way until about 1991. That's nearly 50 years of everyone feeling a bit on edge. It was called a Cold War because the two main countries involved, the United States and the Soviet Union, never had a direct, hot war with soldiers fighting each other on a battlefield. Instead, they competed in other ways. They tried to get more friends on their side, they built up lots of powerful and rather frightening weapons, and they even competed to see who could be the first to fly into space. It was a war of ideas, of influence, and of showing off one's strength, much like a showstopper challenge. The whole thing started because, after World War II, the world was a bit of a mess. Many countries needed rebuilding, and everyone was looking for the best way to do it. The United States and the Soviet Union had been on the same side during that war, but once it was over, they looked at each other and realized they had completely different ideas about how the world should be run. This disagreement was so strong and so deep that it split the world into two camps, each watching the other very carefully and with a great deal of suspicion. So, you see, it wasn't a war with cannons and tanks firing between the two main powers, but it was a serious business nonetheless. The tension was always there, simmering away just under the surface, like heat in a proving drawer. It shaped the world for generations, influencing everything from politics to the movies people watched, and even the lessons children learned in school. The goal for each side was to make their way of life seem the very best, the winning recipe for the whole world to follow. And that, my dears, is where our story of this very long and frosty competition begins, a global bake-off of sorts with very high stakes indeed. On one side of this global kitchen, we had the United States of America. Think of America as a baker who believes in lots of individual choice. This baker thinks everyone should be able to open their own little cake shop if they wish. They can choose their own recipes, sell their cakes for whatever price they think is fair, and keep the money they make. This idea is all about freedom, being your own boss, and having the chance to become very successful if your cakes are popular. The American baker would encourage lots of different cake shops to open, believing that competition makes everyone's cakes better in the end. They wanted to share this recipe for success with the rest of the world. On the other side, we had the Soviet Union, which was a very large and powerful country made up of Russia and other surrounding nations. The Soviet baker had a completely different philosophy. This baker believed that one big state-owned bakery should make all the cakes for everyone. The idea was that everything would be shared equally. Everyone would work together in the big bakery, and everyone would get the same share of the cakes no matter what job they did. This baker thought that having lots of little competing shops was messy and unfair because some people might end up with lots of cake while others had none. Their goal was to create a society where everything was owned by the community and shared out fairly by the government. These two big powers were like the head judges of the world. After World War II, many countries in Europe and Asia were weak and looking for a strong friend to help them rebuild. The United States would go to a country and say, "Let us help you. We will give you money and support to build your own little cake shops, just like ours." They offered a recipe for freedom and prosperity. This team of countries, including friends like Great Britain, France, and West Germany, became known as the Western Bloc. They believed in democracy, where people could vote for their leaders, and in a free market where people could buy and sell things as they pleased. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union would go to other countries, mostly in Eastern Europe, and say, "Join our big bakery. We will protect you and make sure everyone gets a fair share. They offered a recipe for equality and security. These countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany became known as the Eastern Bloc. They had a different system, where the government controlled almost everything, from the factories to the farms, and there was only one political party in charge. So the world was divided, with two very different head bakers, each absolutely convinced that their recipe for running a country was the only one that was right. Let's look more closely at these two recipes for society. The American recipe is called capitalism. It's a bit like a village fete with a baking competition. Anyone can enter their cake. You can use your grandmother's secret recipe or invent something completely new. You buy your own ingredients, you use your own oven, and you set up your own little stall to sell your slices. If people love your Victoria sponge, they will buy it and you will make money. You can use that money to buy a bigger oven or open a proper shop. Another baker might make a fantastic lemon drizzle, creating competition. This makes everyone try harder to bake the most delicious cake possible. In capitalism, private people, not the government, own the businesses or the bakeries. The main idea behind capitalism is freedom of choice. You can choose what to buy, where to work, and if you have a good idea and work hard, you can become very successful. The government's role is a bit like the fete organizer. It sets some basic rules like food hygiene standards to make sure no one gets a tummy ache. But it doesn't tell you what kind of cake to bake or how much to charge for it. The hope is that all this individual effort and competition will make the whole village or country a wealthier and more innovative place. Of course, there is a risk. If your cake is a flop and nobody buys it, you might lose the money you spent on ingredients. There can be winners and, sadly, some losers. Now let's pop over to the other kitchen and look at the Soviet recipe, which is called communism. Imagine if the village council decided to take charge of all the baking for the fete. They would own the one big kitchen, all the ovens and all the ingredients. Everyone in the village would be given a job in that kitchen. Some would mix the batter, some would watch the ovens, and others would slice the finished cakes. The council would decide to bake one type of cake, perhaps a simple fruit cake, to make sure there's enough for everyone. At the end of the day, every villager gets an equal slice of cake, no matter what job they did in the kitchen. The main idea behind communism is equality. The goal is to have no rich or poor people, just one community where everything is shared. There are no private cake shops, so there is no competition. The government, representing the community, owns everything. The factories, the farms, and all the businesses. They believe this is a fairer system because it prevents one person from becoming very wealthy while another struggles. However, the downside is a lack of choice. You get the fruitcake the council decides to bake, and that's that. There's less reason to invent a new, exciting recipe because there's no personal reward for doing so. This was the fundamental difference that set the two sides so firmly against each other. After World War II, the winning countries had to decide what to do with Germany, the country that had started the trouble. They decided to slice it up, a bit like a round cake, into 4 pieces. The United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union each took a piece to look after. The capital city, Berlin, was also deep inside the Soviet section, and it too was sliced into 4 little pieces. The idea was to work together to help Germany get back on its feet. But remember, our main bakers had very different recipes for how to do that. Soon, this temporary division started to look rather permanent. The American, British, and French bakers decided to mix their ingredients together. They joined their 3 slices of Germany to create a new country called West Germany. They helped it set up its own little cake shops, following the capitalist recipe. It became a democracy with lots of freedom and a bustling economy. They did the same with their 3 little slices of Berlin, creating West Berlin. But the Soviet Union kept its slice separate, creating East Germany. It set up one big state-owned bakery, following the communist recipe. So now we had 2 Germanys side by side, one a taste of the West and one a taste of the East. This created a rather peculiar problem, especially in Berlin. West Berlin was like a little island of capitalism, a colourful cake shop full of choice, floating in the middle of communist East Germany. People in East Germany could see the freedom and the wonderful things available just a short walk away in West Berlin. Many of them were not happy with the plain fruitcake they were getting every day, so they started to leave. Thousands and thousands of people, especially skilled workers like doctors and engineers, packed their bags and simply walked from East Berlin into West Berlin to start a new life. This was a terrible look for the communist recipe. It was like all the customers leaving one bakery to go to the one next door. To stop this from happening, the leaders of East Germany, with the backing of the Soviet Union, did something quite shocking. Overnight, in August 1961, they put up a fence. It started with barbed wire, and then it became a huge, ugly concrete wall. This was the Berlin Wall. It completely surrounded West Berlin, trapping it. The wall had guard towers, armed soldiers, and a dangerous death strip in the middle. It split families, friends, and a whole city in two. The wall became the most famous symbol of the Cold War, a stark, grey, concrete proof of the division between the two worlds, a barrier built not to keep people out, but to lock them in. Now, things were about to get very, very tense. Imagine you're in a baking competition, and you notice the baker at the next station has placed a canister of highly flammable gas right next to your oven. You would feel extremely nervous, wouldn't you? Well, that's very much like what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. It was probably the moment the world came closest to a full-blown, catastrophic nuclear war. The whole situation was like a batch of dough left in a proving drawer that was far too hot, ready to explode at any second. It was a terrifying time for everyone. Here is what happened. The United States had a new young president named John F. Kennedy. Not far from the coast of Florida, there is a small island nation called Cuba. Cuba had recently had a revolution, and its new leader, Fidel Castro, had decided to follow the communist recipe and become a firm friend of the Soviet Union. This made the United States very nervous. It was like having the rival bakery set up a very loud and unfriendly stall right on your front lawn. The American government was not at all pleased and had been trying to find ways to remove Castro from power. The leader of the Soviet Union, a man named Nikita Khrushchev, saw an opportunity. He decided to secretly send powerful nuclear missiles to Cuba and set them up there. These missiles were like incredibly powerful weapons that could reach cities all across the United States in just a few minutes. When an American spy plane flew over Cuba and took photographs of these missile sites being built, President Kennedy and his advisors were horrified. The flammable gas was right next to their oven. They could not allow this. It was a direct and very dangerous threat to the safety of the entire country. For 13 days, the world held its breath. President Kennedy decided to set up a naval quarantine, which was really a blockade around Cuba, to stop any more Soviet ships with military supplies from getting through. American and Soviet ships faced each other on the high seas. People everywhere were terrified, stocking up on food and water, fearing the worst. Behind the scenes, there were frantic secret negotiations. In the end, thankfully, a deal was made. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and in return, the United States promised not to invade the island. Secretly, the US also agreed to remove some of its own missiles, which were stationed in Turkey, near the Soviet border. It was a close shave, a soggy bottom avoided at the very last second. While there was much tension on Earth, the competition between the two bakers also reached for the heavens. This was the space race, and it was a much more inspiring, though still very competitive, part of the Cold War. It was as if both sides had decided to see who could bake the most spectacular, high-rising, gravity-defying soufflé. Instead of weapons, they were competing with rockets, satellites, and brave astronauts. It was a contest to prove whose science, technology, and, by extension, whose way of life was superior. It really captured the imagination of the entire world. The Soviet Union got off to a flying start, which honestly was a bit of a shock to the Americans. In 1957, they launched the very first satellite into space. It was called Sputnik, a little metal ball that went beep, beep, beep as it orbited the Earth. It might not sound like much now, but at the time it was an incredible achievement and a huge victory for the communist recipe. The Americans were stunned. They felt they had fallen behind in the most important technological race in history. This Sputnik moment made them pour enormous amounts of money and effort into their own space program called NASA. The Soviets kept racking up the firsts. They sent the first animal into space, a lovely dog named Laika. Then in 1961, they achieved something truly historic. A cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit the Earth. He was a global hero. It seemed the Soviet bakery was winning every round of the technical challenge. This spurred President Kennedy to make a very bold and daring promise. He declared before the world that America would commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth before the end of the decade. It was an astonishingly ambitious goal. This challenge set off a decade of incredible innovation. Thousands of scientists and engineers worked tirelessly. There were successes and tragic failures on both sides, but in the end, the Americans achieved their spectacular goal. On July 20th, 1969, the world watched on television as astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped out of the Apollo 11 lunar module and became the first person to walk on the moon. His famous words, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind," echoed across the globe. It was a tremendous victory for the United States, the ultimate showstopper bake that left everyone in awe and in many ways marked a turning point in the race for technological supremacy. Living during the Cold War was a bit like living in a house where you knew there was a gas leak somewhere. You might go about your daily life, going to school, baking cakes, watching television, but there was always a background hum of anxiety. People were genuinely afraid that a nuclear war could break out at any moment. In schools, children in America and Britain practiced duck and cover drills, where they would hide under their desks. It seems a bit silly now, as a wooden desk wouldn't offer much protection from a nuclear bomb, but it was a sign of how real the fear was in people's everyday lives. This fear seeped into popular culture too. Many films and books were about spies, secret agents, and the threat of nuclear annihilation. Think of the James Bond stories, where a handsome British spy was always saving the world from some villainous plot that could trigger a war between the East and West. On the other hand, there was also a lot of propaganda. Both sides used posters, films, and news reports to paint the other as evil and dangerous. In the West, communists were often shown as grim, shadowy figures who wanted to take away everyone's freedom. In the East, capitalists were portrayed as greedy, selfish people who only cared about money. For those living in the Eastern Bloc, behind what was called the Iron Curtain, life was very different. There was less freedom. The government controlled the newspapers and television, so people only heard the official story. It was difficult to travel to Western countries. There were often shortages of things you could easily buy in the West, like nice clothes or different types of food. While the government provided jobs, housing, and healthcare, there was a sense of being constantly watched by the secret police. People had to be careful about what they said, even to their friends and neighbors, for fear of being reported for disagreeing with the communist recipe. Despite all the tension and fear, people still managed to live their lives, fall in love, raise families, and find joy. There were also moments of hope and connection. Sports competitions like the Olympic Games became another arena for the rivalry, but they also allowed people from both sides to meet and compete peacefully. Cultural exchanges, where musicians or ballet dancers would tour, showed that despite the political differences, people were still just people. But the underlying feeling for nearly 50 years was one of uncertainty, a quiet, persistent worry about what the other side might do next. It was a long, slow period of holding one's breath. All competitions, even very long ones, must eventually come to an end. The end of the Cold War wasn't a single event, but more like a cake slowly crumbling. One of the biggest reasons for this was that the Soviet Union's recipe simply wasn't working very well anymore. The big state-owned bakery was struggling. It was spending enormous amounts of money on weapons and its military to keep up with the United States. This meant there was less money for everything else. The shelves in the shops were often empty, and the economy was in a terrible state. The fruitcake was getting smaller and staler. In the mid-1980s, a new, younger leader came to power in the Soviet Union. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. He could see that the kitchen was a mess and that a new approach was needed. He introduced two big new ideas. The first was called glasnost, which meant openness. He allowed people to talk more freely and criticize the government, something that had been forbidden for decades. The second was perestroika, which meant restructuring. This was an attempt to reform the communist economy, allowing a few small private cake shops to open and bringing a little bit of the capitalist recipe into the mix. These new ideas were like opening a window in a very stuffy room. A fresh breeze of freedom began to blow through the Soviet Union and across Eastern Europe. People who had been quiet for years suddenly felt they could demand change. In 1989, a wave of peaceful revolutions swept across the countries of the Eastern Bloc. In Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, people demanded free elections and an end to communist rule. The governments, without the threat of the Soviet army to back them up as it had in the past, simply gave way. The most famous moment came in November 1989. The government of East Germany announced that people would be allowed to travel to the West. That very night, huge crowds gathered at the Berlin Wall. The guards were confused and, facing the cheerful, determined masses, they simply opened the gates. People surged through, cheering, crying, and hugging relatives they hadn't seen in years. Soon people were on top of the wall with hammers and chisels, physically tearing down the symbol of the Cold War. It was an incredibly joyful and moving sight. Over the next 2 years, the Soviet Union itself fell apart, breaking up into Russia and several other independent countries. By the end of 1991, the Cold War was officially over. The chilly standoff had finally thawed. So, the great competition came to an end. The chilly air warmed up and the world changed forever. But just like a classic recipe, the story of the Cold War has lessons that are still important for us today. It teaches us how dangerous it can be when people refuse to understand each other's point of view. The deep mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union, between capitalism and communism, nearly led to a global disaster. It shows that talking and finding common ground, even with those you disagree with profoundly, is always a better recipe than building walls and preparing for a fight. The end of the Cold War redrew the map of the world. Countries that had been part of the Eastern Bloc were free to choose their own path. Many, like Poland and the Czech Republic, chose to join the Western team, adopting democracy and capitalism. Germany was reunited into one country again. But the collapse of the old order also left some new problems. In some places, old tensions between different groups of people which had been suppressed under communist rule flared up again into conflict. The world became more complicated in some ways, with new challenges to face. It wasn't a simple, happy ever after ending. The legacy of the Cold War is still with us. We still live in a world with thousands of nuclear weapons, a frightening leftover from that era of fear. The relationship between Russia and the countries of the West is still sometimes frosty, full of suspicion that feels like an echo of the past. The competition between different ideas about how to run a country continues. The Cold War shaped the alliances, the technologies, and the political problems that our leaders are still dealing with today. Understanding this long, tense period of history helps us understand the news we see on television every night. But there is also a hopeful lesson from this story. It shows us that even the biggest, most frightening divisions can come to an end. It shows the power of people demanding freedom, as they did at the Berlin Wall. And it reminds us of the incredible things humanity can achieve when it is determined, like reaching for the moon. The Cold War was a long and difficult bake, with many moments where it nearly ended in a soggy bottom. But by learning from its story, we can hopefully choose better recipes for our future. Recipes based on cooperation, understanding, and a shared desire to make the world a safer and kinder place for everyone.